Hi, I'm Keegan, and this is A Bunch of Gamers. This is GM Talks, and I'm joined today with Travis Legge for the Scarred Lands. Welcome, Travis.
Hello, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so you're kind of the lead for the Scarred Lands, right? Or at least the creative lead?
Yeah, so I'm the line developer, which basically means that under the direct supervision of Matthew Dawkins, who oversees all of 5e, I sort of set the, I guess, roadmap for products and then generally do the direct development of each product as well. Though I'm hoping, depending on how things shake out in the coming months, to be able to expand that a little bit, have a few other developers come on as we expand the line. We'll see where things go. But since I took over as the line developer, I've basically also developed each individual product for Scarlet.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah.
So for those not familiar with the Scarred Lands, in your words, how would you describe the setting?
Oh, it's post-apocalyptic fantasy. I often describe it as if you took a issue of Heavy Metal magazine and slammed it into a player's handbook, you would have Scarred Lands. Within living memory, ending about 150 years ago, there was a great war on the planet between the gods and the Titans. It's sort of inspired by Greek mythology, but different in the sense that this war happened while people were there on the ground among the mortals. So if you're playing a human, um, it's quite possible that one of your great grandparents fought in this war shoulder to shoulder with a god against the Titans and their armies. If you're a member of a long-lived race like an elf or a dwarf, it's entirely possible that you fought in this war um, shoulder to shoulder with gods against Titans and their armies. So it's a very uh, recent event. It had a profound effect, not only culturally on the world, but geographically on the world. Um, there are elements of the world itself that are literal scars from this war. The continent of Gelspad, which is where the player's guide is set, and it's sort of the main continent of play, was the battleground for a lot of these fights, and is uh, basically tainted because the Titans couldn't be truly destroyed. They could be dismembered, imprisoned, um, otherwise sort of incapacitated, but they couldn't be truly killed.
A
So
little exalted in there then.
little bit, yeah, and so like you have things like the eastern coast of Gelspad has the Blood Sea, which is so named because the Titan Kadum lies chained at the floor of the ocean with his heart ripped out, still bleeding. So it so much so that it has turned the ocean red, and his blood corrupts the sea life there.
Okay.
Um, the Hornsaw Forest, which is one of the main settings of our forthcoming sort of mega campaign, uh, Dead Man's Rust, is was once known as the Broadreach Forest, and it was uh, home to numerous elf clans and the Broadreach unicorn, which was sort of this beautiful, peaceful animal, kind of as you'd expect a fantasy unicorn to be. During the Titans War, when the gods cornered the Titan Mormo and rent her form asunder, tore her into little bits, and scattered her across the world, most of her, this happened in the Broadreach Forest, and most of her blood sort of pooled into the earth there and absorbed into the trees and tainted it, tainting the wildlife as well. So the unicorns that were there mutated into these extremely heavily muscled uh, mockeries of a unicorn that have like a serrated horn, and hence they're called the Hornsaw unicorns now, which is the name of where the name of the forest now comes from. And
Okay.
they're now super violent and vicious and very very dangerous animals when they were once sort of these peaceful creatures that one might associate with unicorns. So those are just a couple of examples of how this event altered the world physically. There was also at one point a grand empire that spanned the entire continent of Galspad, and that shattered during the Divine War. And so now you have various nations and city-states rising up, trying to create a life anew in the wreckage of this war. Not all of them are good people. So you have some sort of institutional enemies that the heroes can stand against, who have sprung up, to seize, they're trying to seize this opportunity to put forth their own sort of selfish and evil agendas. And so the players have an opportunity for intrigue as well as they're standing against some of these nations that are rising. You have in the south of Galspad, you have the Calastian hegemony, which is the kingdom of Virduk, who is a human supremacist, basically, and he wishes to have humanity rule and subjugate the rest of the species on Galspad to live as slaves and servants. So he's not a nice guy. And constantly sort of engaged in conquest and trying to expand his borders. So that's just one of the mortal enemies that you can sort of stand against in the Scarlands.
Okay. So I'm going to Dead Man's Rest then. That's your upcoming Kickstarter, and that'll be out by the time this comes out this week, I think, because this will be out next Friday.
I believe so, yeah. That's what I'm told next week. As of this recording, we're recording it on the 13th, not to overdate our thing or anything, but I'm told next week. So by the time people can hear this, they'll be able to run right over to Kickstarter and back it, I hope.
Perfect. And so you mentioned it's a mega campaign, so 1st to 20th level or somewhere in between?
It's first to 10th, and basically covers. There are on-ramps going from starting characters all the way up through. If you've been playing your character for several years, there are ways to on-ramp it that are built in. It is designed as there's sort of this main plot that runs through it. That's meant to take you from 1 to 10, but it's also built in a sandbox fashion, so you don't necessarily need to do. There are certain things that have to happen in a certain order, but a lot of it you don't need to do in any order whatsoever. You can step into it, step away from it. You can use it as fertile ground for games that don't even touch on the central plot if you wanted to. It's very similar in approach to like Storm King's Thunder in that regard. The idea that you have this sort of main narrative that takes you through, but there's so much utility outside of that narrative as well.
Okay, so then I'm assuming it's more of an event-based adventure rather than a site-based adventure then? Is that a correct assumption?
It's a little of A, a little of B, I suppose. There are a series of circumstances. The main plot assumes that if you're starting off first level, it opens in the city of Leone, which is the capital of the Manticora Confederacy. The Manticora are a people who, during the Divine War, served the god of chaos and destruction as his personal hunting retinue, and got quite a reputation for being these brutal warriors. And after the war, they've decided that they don't necessarily like that reputation. They want to sort of explore the idea of being, quote unquote, civil. So they've founded this city and are dedicating a lot of their resources to learning and to the arts. So they have a festival there called Carnival Flowers, I believe. And this starts off, or Night of Chronicles. That's the one that this one starts off during. So it starts off with the Night of Chronicles. The players are there probably just to enjoy a festival. And there's a bunch of sort of side plots and interesting, fun things they can get into while they're there. But they also meet this bard who is elderly dwarf, veteran of the Divine War, and has not been to his home in he's from the Broadreach Horizon originally. He's one of the Broadreach dwarves, which are now basically an endangered species. he starts talking to the party. He's looking for an escort to take him home so he can spend his final years there, and that's kind of what kicks off the action. What were you gonna ask?
Okay. Oh, I was gonna ask, what do you think with that? Because I do like all the cultural stuff, because that definitely feels a bit more distinct from a standard D&D campaign.
Right.
Is how, besides the cultural aspect, what do you think separates this kind of mega campaign from other mega campaigns like your Storm King Thunders and your Descent into Avernus?
I do think that uh, a couple things. One, exploring that culture, exploring the setting of the Scarred Lands, it is very much rooted in areas that are unique to the Scarred Lands. Now, that's not to say that if you're running a different fifth edition world or even a homebrew world, that you couldn't lift these locations up and place them there. But these are very steeped in the lore specific to the Scarred Lands. We're dealing with people that are specific to the Scarred Lands. And we're dealing a lot with sort of this idea of the aftermath of this grand event and how 150 years later that has shaped certain cultures, that has shaped certain people's motivations. There are one of the principal antagonists of the uh, campaign is the necromancers of the city of Glividatel, and they're basically they run an entire metropolis where the living are pretty much a cash crop for them. They're all ultimately the living are considered to be more beneficial to them once they are dead, and they create armies of undead from things along those lines. And their ultimate goal is twofold. One, they wish to rule over all of Gelsped, but two, they wish to find a way to pierce the veil between life and death without having to rely on undeath. And that motivates a lot of what's going on in this adventure. Sort of trying to achieve the best of both worlds, have all the benefits of lichdom with none of the drawbacks. Is kind of their pie in the sky goal.
Okay, that's kind
And
of a cool goal. I like that. Also, the human cash crop made me just think back to your mission statement, going, "Yeah, that's pretty fucking metal right there."
right, exactly. Not great. Yeah, it's not a nice place to vacation by any stretch. And the necromancers of Glividatel, they really are the most horrific sort of antagonist I've ever encountered in a fantasy setting. They, you know, they have developed this technique called sharding, where they can cleave off small portions of a living person's soul and the memories attached to that, and then integrate those into their undead, which serves two purposes. One, it allows them to have incremental punishments for the living that are far more terrifying than killing them. And two, when they do that, it creates it. Along with those memories comes a bit of sort of the spark of innovation that a human or the living soul would have. So they make their undead more competent by doing so. So that's one of the punishments that the people of Glividatel have to live under the fear of, is that if they cut out of line, they might get their teenage years taken from their mind and put into a zombie, so that zombie will be a slightly better swords person or farmer. It's really kind of horrifying. They have these little they have these undead children that they use that are vaguely psionic. They can sort of tell if someone is experiencing too great of an emotion, because emotional expression is reserved for those who are capable of performing magic in Glividatel. If you're not a wizard, you're only allowed a certain amount of emotional expression. And so these kids will sort of run around and just, these eyeless undead children will run around and like point and scream at people who are feeling too much. Yeah, it's a horror show, very much so in Glividatel.
I'm gonna be honest. Like, if there was a little eyeless zombie baby screaming, I feel like there just everyone would light up like a Christmas tree to it. Everyone's just like, well, it was good while it lasted, everyone.
Well, and when you think about how horrible would your existence have to be that you become somewhat blasé to that site?
That's fair. Just
You know, and of course, this is one of the places the adventurers have to try to get into, whether through deception or through trying to kick in the front door, because there's one of the MacGuffins of the campaign is guarded within a very well protected stronghold within this city. So there's if you're following the main plot, there's really no way to not wind up in Glivet Hotel at some point. Which is great because I love horror, so it worked out really, really well that way.
okay. So I think you answered my next question then, because my next question is going to be, what's the favorite part of this campaign that you guys are making? And it sounds like it's this part.
I'm really spoiled for choice because, and it's so. One of the reasons we refer to it as mega campaign is because it's so hard to codify its theme or feeling. It narratively touches on a lot of bases but it does so in a way that if you are following that sort of central narrative, makes sense. Much like life, things don't just sort of fall into like a genre, right?
Yeah.
You start off this adventure and it's sort of this sweet, tender thing where you're helping this elderly person go home so they can retire. And when you get to their home, you find out, you take them through and there's a bit of overland travel. So you get to see a little bit of what Central Gelspad is like before you dive into here's the thing that changes the status quo. You know what I mean? You get to just kind of see a little bit of what it's like normally as you're escorting them to the Broadreach Horizon. And when they arrive there, they have not been in the forest since prior to the Divine War. So they don't know, as the players most likely do not know, what all has transpired there over the course of the last 150 years. And so you have this forest, the Hornsaw Forest. It's corrupted, it's bleak, it's dark, and everything in it wants to kill you. And it's also a very terrifying place. It is home to not only the Hornsaw Unicorn, but one of my favorite creatures in all of fantasy, let alone in Scarredlands, the Blood Reaper, which is a 10-foot tall, 4-armed mantis that has basically scimitars for lower arms, and just loves killing, really for no reason. It's just super aggressive. Doesn't hunt for food or sport. It just hunts because it's angry at the universe. So that's kind of like one of the that's one of the indigenous life forms here. It's a spooky place, but when Mormo's corruption happened to the Hornsaw Forest, the elves who lived there underwent this grand ritual to sort of enter the forest spiritually and try to cleanse the taint. And they spent about 100 years in there doing that. While they were doing that, the dwarves who were indigenous to that forest were pretty much down to a person, rounded up by the necromancers of Glivet Hotel, kidnapped and compelled into slavery to work the forges to give arms and armor to the undead while they were in Glivet Hotel. So fast forward a century, the elves reemerge from this, and though they were unable to cleanse the forest of taint, they have cleansed a small band of the northern border of the forest, which is now called the Broadreach Horizon, which is one of the places where a lot of the action of this campaign is set. And each of these elf clans, there's 29 elf clans, I believe. Each of these clans has their own village in the horizon. But they get out, the first thing they figure out is the Broadreach dwarves are gone, so they go break them out. And have now created them a new home, so they have their own village in the horizon as well. But so you get there and you get to get this feeling of like, how has this impacted these people? What has been the effect not only of this sort of magical spiritual battle that they engaged in for a century, but also the effect of, you know, the physical, ecological consequences they're dealing with, right? They're looking at their once beautiful home and they have a simple scrap of it, really, by comparison, that they're able to hold on to. And, you know, how do they hang on to hope in light of that? What, uh, what do they do to try to fight back against that corruption? There's a lot of storytelling ground to mine there.
I've got several ideas. A running joke between my players and me is that I am a sadist, where it's like a sadist, but I do it with sad things, and it sounds like the Scarred Lands will scratch that itch for me.
Very much so. Yeah, there's a lot of you can really. I mean, you can absolutely get into like blood is spraying everywhere, and it's massacre and mayhem. But you can also just tug at heartstrings all day long in this setting, um, and that also kind of brings it to the next thing. Is it's kind of like I hate to put it this way, but it's kind of like a Russian doll of misery. This campaign, so you get
Sold, sold.
so you get there and you start, learning about the Broadreach Horizon and interacting with these people. You find out some secrets about your friend that you're traveling with here. That maybe his tales of heroism during the Divine War are embellished, as a bard might do. And there's some consequences to that. But you also find out that there are a group of people there in the Broadreach Horizon called the Hollow Legionnaires. And they're actually from an area called the Gleaming Valley, which is just to the west of the Broadreach Horizon. And they are there on a mission of sort of like peaceful cooperation. The area they're from is one of the few places in all of Galspad that wasn't really messed up too much by the Divine War. And it was given to their forefathers as a gift by the god Corian for their noble service. And the way that the Hollow Legionnaires came to be was that Corian's personal guard were known as the Hollow Knights. They had been mortals who had served him so faithfully that when the Divine War started, he placed their bodies and the bodies of their families in stasis and moved their souls into this enchanted plate mail armor. It was virtually indestructible. They're immune to spells below level 6. They're really they're combat tanks. They're incredibly potent creatures, the Hollow Knights. Okay. But they showed such great valor and they were so effective in war that the god Vangal, the god of chaos and destruction, the ones the Manticora served, became jealous of the Hollow Knights. So he went into the crypt where all their families and all their bodies were laying in stasis awaiting victory so they could be reanimated and have their reward. And he just chopped all their bodies to bits because he was jealous at their combat prowess.
Wow.
Yeah. Vangal's not a very nice person.
No.
So
I gathered.
So, war ends. Corian brings the Hollow Knights back to this crypt and is like, here's your reward. And they're all like, ah, and they're horrified. And so he says, well, I can't do anything about that, but I can give you this land that I was going to give you and give you your freedom and you can make a new life for yourselves. Well, the Hollow Knights had been in this pseudo-mystical state for so long that they had largely forgotten anything about like being people. So they started to create cities in the Gleaming Valley that were based on what they remembered cities should look like, but without any thought towards form or function. And they didn't have, they weren't alive, so they didn't have like biological needs, so they weren't really thinking appropriately. As time went on, they started bringing in living people and redesigning some things and working on it. And they finally, just as they finally started to get their heads around like what is running a country like, what does this mean? They started to realize that they could, go through some of these motions, but they were denied certain aspects of a real life, like offspring, for example. They couldn't reproduce. So they constructed these towers in the Gleaming Valley. They're called spires, and the spires are use some strange magical process that calls to the souls of warriors who died with valor, or died with unfinished business, or died, before their time, or maybe died, retired in a comfy bed surrounded by loved ones, but still just for whatever reason didn't want to go, and brings those souls, attaches them to the spire that sort of most matches their personality, and binds that soul into a suit of armor. And these are the Hollow Legionnaires, and they come out of this with vague memories, maybe, of who they were before, but largely born as new people who are sort of this crossbreed between undead and construct.
Okay.
And so the Hollow Legionnaires are trying to, they've helped build up the Gleaming Valley into this thriving metropolis. There's, or this thriving region. And so now they're like, life's good for us. We want to go make life good for other people. They come to the Broadreach Horizon to try to offer their aid to the Broadreach elves and dwarves in whatever they might need. We're here to help. We're not here to colonize. We're not here to tell you how to run your stuff. We're here to help. But because it's the Scarred Lands and no good deed goes unpunished, while they are there, some of them start to go missing, and things that they have never encountered before start to threaten the Hollow Legionnaires, such as the specter of illness and disease in ways they never could have imagined. And that's really where the campaign starts to ramp up and find its feet, and really get into the meat of the core central plot.
Okay. I don't know if this is just for the campaign, but for the Scarred Lands in general, it seems like there's a really strong theme of war is hell.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the nuances that I think that the elevator pitch of Scarred Lands misses, and it's very difficult to convey without really getting into the setting itself, is the idea that you hear about gods versus titans, and that, I think, summons in the mind of the listener the idea that the gods are somehow virtuous and these titans were somehow bad. And while the titans were in fact bad in Scarred Lands, they were largely, with a few exceptions, they were largely evil through indifference. They didn't care about what their actions did to the little ant-like creatures crawling around on the surface of the planet. It wasn't
the do you apologize for the ant you stepped on kind of thing.
right, exactly. There were a few who were sadistic and malicious to the extreme, but most of them were just forces of nature that didn't really give the matter much thought. The gods, on the other hand, are tied to the alignments. Each of the main divine victors, the primary gods of the setting, is tied to one of the alignment combinations. So their Vangal is a chaotic evil god.
Okay. So are you saying that the Titans do not have an alignment in Scarred Lands?
I wouldn't.
Okay.
Right. They're not like. Right. They're almost kind of beyond alignment. I mean, they each would have, like, if I were to stat them out, they would each have an alignment.
Okay.
But they're not. They're not governed by that in the way that the gods are. The gods are embodiments of these alignments.
Okay.
And when you take anything like that to its extreme, there are bad aspects to it. Even the lawful good god, Hadrad, is kind of a prick, because he's, it's all about the rules. Who cares how you feel about it?
Lawful stupid, as it used to be called, I think.
Right, but in this case, it's more almost like lawful cruel.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Because it's law with an eye toward the greater good, but with zero consideration for how that affects the little guy.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
No,
So
that makes sense.
That makes it more of like a You know, that can be more horrific in a sense, right?
Yeah, that actually
Um,
plays to a lot of the homebrew stuff I always do, where I do that alignment exists, but alignment is defined by gods. So what you think is a good act can still be defined as quote unquote evil simply because a god said so.
right, right. And one of the things that's very interesting about the Scarred Lands, in sort of a contrast to some of the other fantasy settings, and it's a fun thing to play with. Uh, the gods have been present. People who you might talk to up the street in your village might have had a conversation with a god. Once in a while, they show their faces still. It becomes the divine victors, the main eight gods, are doing that less and less as the setting progresses because now that the Titans are gone, they sort of, uh, to get way deep into the metaphysics, they sort of have to keep the world working.
Mm,
So they start becoming more drawn into their celestial responsibilities and less able to focus on getting directly involved in shit going on the surface, right?
yeah.
Um, Not so much the case for the demigods. They're still poking their nose in everybody's business all the time, which I have a great deal of fun with, because they also are pretty intensely tied to an alignment, but not in the sense of an embodiment of it, right? So they
Mm,
get to have some wiggle room and have some fun, and they get to make decisions that maybe would go against. The victors have very rigid natures. The demigods, they get to have some wiggle room with that, so that's fun. But the point I was, I guess, driving at was that there's not a whole lot of confusion about someone's theology, right? You don't.
yeah.
There's not a lot of vagary in how do we appropriately worship Corian. Well, Corian told you 15 years ago, you know, like
I gotcha. My thought process was, as you were describing some of the themes, is like almost like a mishmash of with the Titans being kind of like represented with like Princess Mononoke and the War is Hell kind of being like that movie Come and See. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
I have not seen that one.
It's a former Soviet Union film that was in development hell for several years because it was so anti-war that the censors thought it was anti-Soviet.
Oh, okay,
And it was about this
gotcha.
kid who joined a partisan group during World War II, and it just did not shy away from the horrors of war. It's one of those movies that you want to see once, and then that's enough. But it's a
Mm,
but one of those
I
really
think I've read
powerful.
some. I think I've read some reviews of it. But yeah, now that you
Yeah.
mention it, yeah.
So that's kind of what the descriptions of some like the war stuff you were talking about was evoking in the back of my mind when thinking about Scarred Lands.
Absolutely. And lest any listener think that it's too heavy with that sort of thing. This is one of the beauties of it is that is a one of the knobs on the setting that you can turn whichever way you want. You can very much dive into that and really explore that as a theme of the story you are telling, right? Or you can dial it way back and have that be background noise within the setting, right?
Yeah.
It's something that nothing hinges particularly on like that having to be something you've got to cope with. But it is if that's something that you do want to explore and you do think there's fertile ground there to grow your stories in, it's ample. There's ample opportunity to use it in the
Yeah.
setting.
No, absolutely. I just that was the part that just made me go, "Huh, I could." Just kind of like picking at
Oh
it
yeah,
as as you do. Uh, so to the back to the Dead Man's Rust. Um, I'm kind of wondering then because you'd mentioned it was sandboxing and things like that. What kind of how is the story structured for like the points that they do have to hit? How much leeway do you leave, and what kind of do you leave a lot of suggestions for if players go one way or another, or do you just have very specific bullet points, or do you make assumptions of how players are going to tackle problems?
There's actually, and I'm super proud of this, and I wish I could take more credit for being directly responsible for it. But the team of writers I had working on this book really pulled it together in terms of coming up with a way to build. I gave them the very, very loose directive that everywhere that the characters went had to be dripping with plot hooks that could bring them back to the main adventure, right? Didn't necessarily have to, but could. And my authors went totally just above and beyond the call of duty in generating these things. Each place you go, each person you meet, every faction that's introduced has a number of sort of story hooks that are presented with them. Small side quests, you might say, right?
Yeah.
And each of them has one or two of those that will, if followed, lead you back onto the path for the adventure. And so that works in a number of ways. One, it really gives illusion of this sounds derogatory. It's not meant to. It's an actual term in game design, illusion of choice.
Yeah.
The idea, it presents that in a really interesting and cool way that I've never seen outside of something like The Witcher. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Outside of a video game that's that broad. I think we really nailed that, and that's 100% credit to my writing team. So you have that aspect, but that also means that the GM can look at it and say, okay, I need to get this back on track. Let's throw these three things in their way, and I'm sure they'll pick up one of them, right? And if they don't, I have three more on deck I can throw in their way. There are certain things, certain choices that the players make are going to make it more, it might make it more immediate for them to find a solution than others. By way of example, I mentioned earlier the Hollow Legionnaires. If someone is playing a Hollow Legionnaire in this campaign, it's going to become very personally important to them relatively quickly to start handling that main plot. They become directly imperiled. I don't mind saying that playing Hollow Legionnaires in this. In fact, we have a thing in the introduction of the book where it says it recommends different approaches you can take as you're setting up your group for this game, and we refer to the hard mode as playing as a group of Hollow Legionnaires.
Okay.
Because because they encounter this thing called Legionnaire's Rust, which is what the campaign is named from.
Okay.
It's a magical plague that is absolutely resistant to all sorts of magical healing. Remove Curse doesn't do anything for it. Paladins can still catch it. It's a new type of threat. It's a new type of disease. And so if you're playing Hollow Legionnaires, you're in for some trouble if you just decide to ignore that going around, because you'll catch it and then you'll die. Like that's
Yep.
so it really does become, and the way that they put that together, the way that we were able to craft sort of how this disease progresses and how it can be kept at bay to make it an ongoing threat without sucking the fun out of playing through it. The writers did a fantastic job of that. The other thing that was important to me to do was one of the things we have up front, the introduction of this book, is we have an index of named NPCs. And that index also has like a real brief, like 2-sentence description of who they are and what they want, basically. So you can always drop back in to that index and say, okay, I need to steer this campaign one way or the other. Who do I grab and drop in their lap? So that's a neat little thing. And we've added an alternate advancement mechanic where you can, rather than like counting the XP, you can clock advancement based on the number of side quests and or main campaign beats they've hit.
Okay.
So that's another way where you can sort of encourage and sort of guide people in a direction. Or also, the campaign at one point, as I mentioned before, requires you to go into Glividotel and acquire a thing. That's not something you want to try to do at 4th or 5th level. It's going to end bad for you and the whole group. So you can go in and say, oh, well, fortunately, we have this wealth of side quests that we can have you kind of run around and attack a little while, all of which retain enough immediacy that it doesn't feel like you're just out in the field killing boars to get XP. You know what I mean?
No, I totally get what you mean. That's why I always use alternate XP in my D&D games. So. Nope.
Right. So everybody has their agendas and their things. And the other cool thing about it is everybody has something they can offer to the players to help them in their goals, right? Even a lot of the enemy factions that you run into in this game, they're absolutely presented as antagonists, but there's also a couple of hooks in there where it's like, yeah, these people are terrible, but if you get into bed with them, you can get this thing, which will help you in this way. You know what I mean?
The standard DM moral dilemma stuff.
Right, exactly. And so you can really wind up forging some alliances of convenience that I think also make for cool, fertile ground to, carry the campaign on beyond the covers of the book, right? Because, just by way of example, pulling one thing off the top of my head, as I mentioned before, the Titan Mormo was killed there in the Hornsaw Forest. That's why it is what it is. There's a group called the Cult of the Serpent Descendant, and their whole purpose for existing is to try to resurrect Mormo. And they have amassed a great deal of magical prowess and influence through the area, right? So you might make a truce with the Cult of the Serpent Ascendant to deal with the immediate problem. But the minute the immediate problem is done, now all bets are off, and you have this enemy who has now had an intimate working knowledge of how you operate. You know what I mean? So now you have an antagonist that's ready baked, that you have a history with, that you can have those sort of Superman Lex Luthor kind of standoffs with.
The DC fan in me really appreciates that reference.
I love cultivating that stuff. I love the idea that, session 20 of a campaign, I can bring someone that you didn't like on session 3, but you wound up having to work with. And now, when they do the final heel turn, now you have all that history to draw from. You know what I mean? That stuff tickles me pink as a storyteller. So I tried to seed as much of that through it as we could. So yeah, it's very robust in the way that you can attack that, and in ways that the GM can sort of twist the dials and pull the strings on who's a friend, who's an enemy. Even going beyond like the macro level of like these people who are clearly evil. There's, like I said, like 29 clans of the Broadreach elves, and not all of them are particularly friendly. Not all of them are particularly what one might call good. So you might wind up earning the enmity of one of those clans, or more than one of those clans. And that can turn into the seed for the next step. So that's another thing when we talk about it being a mega campaign is there are so many things that are introduced in here that either plant the seed or give you the opportunity, once the main threat has been addressed, to go back and resolve, that you can absolutely take it through all the way up to 20th level. One last example, and then I'll stop rambling and let you get into the question. I know I talk a lot. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Matthew gave me the same runaround. He apologized for it too. I'm noticing a trend with you Onyx Path folks.
We're talkers, absolutely.
I
But
love it.
so there's I mentioned to you about the Broadreach elves giving themselves over to the forest. There were a group of them that were too tainted or too saddened to do so, and so they went to this place called the Vale of Sorrows and basically committed mass suicide. And their misery was so great that it mixed with the taint that Mormo had left and created what's called a woodwrack dragon, which is a dragon made basically out of living wood, spite, and misery. And there's one quest chain that is introduced, a side quest that's introduced, where you have an opportunity to make a long-standing, to the degree of creating a new playable race, change to the world. But one of the things you need to do is go get that dragon's heart.
All right.
So that's probably not something you're even necessarily going to try at 10th level. You know what I mean?
Fair. I don't know. It's pretty hard to kill 10th level characters, man. I've tried.
It is, but rack dragons are pretty nuts. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the Scarred Lands creature collection, but there are some of
not
the
yet. I only have the
there are
player's
some
guide.
rack dragons. Oh, you got to check out creature collection. It's madness. I think there's a couple rack dragons in the back of the player's guide, but because rack dragons, that's another little fun setting quirk. The true dragons in Scarred Lands all buggered off and hid when the Titans War started. They didn't want anything to do with it. So the Titans used this thing called rack, which is basically it's negative emotion mixed with elemental energy. And they use these to form their dragons. So rather than being motivated by like, I'm going to hoard treasure and, and knowledge and just have a big pile of stuff to sit on, the dragons that you face in Scarred Lands are motivated by just every negative emotion you can fathom, fueled at elemental intensity.
All right.
So they're not nice, and they don't play nice. But yeah, so that's like that's just one of the sort of higher level conflicts you can get into. Is, well, let's go slay this rack dragon, and but it's worth it. The other thing we tried to do is make sure that all of these story hooks and side quests and the main plot, the risk is justified in the rewards you can reap for the characters and for the setting as you engage in these things. So.
All right. So this one's a little more directed to you rather than the book as a whole. Is when you're running your own Scarred Lands games, what kind of media, books, TV, movies do you draw from for inspiration?
Oh goodness, that's a good question. That's a really good question. All sorts of them. I'm a giant nerd. I used to work in independent film, so I'm a big film geek. I will often drop pop culture references in left and right, both from within and outside of geekdom. I pull on Supernatural probably an awful lot, the TV show, but part of that's because I run 2 streams right now. Every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern on the Onyx Path channel, I run Scarred Lands: A Family Affair, and the premise of that stream is that all these characters of various backgrounds and races were all adopted by the same halfling. So they're brothers and sisters, but one is a scrag, like a sea troll, and the other one's a Slytherin rat folk, and one of them is a tiefling. So like it's a adoptive chosen family.
Okay.
And the supernatural vibe in that game is strong. The the family first over everything else. We'll burn the world down to make sure that we're okay. All that stuff. But by the same token, one of my favorite fantasy touchstones, because I think it gets missed a lot in D&D these days, is Dragonlance, the first Dragonlance book, Dragons of Autumn Twilight. I fall back to the reference of that a lot particularly when describing the actual horrors that are being faced sometimes. I've never read anything as terrifying as the description in that book of the first time a dragon attacks.
That was pretty good, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, like in any media, nothing I've ever read has scared me that much. You know what I mean? And grossed me out that much, by the way, because it doesn't just end with the fear; it ends with this horrible description of like this poor person not dead and like melting. It's just
yeah.
So that's kind of the energy I try to bring.
That's nice. Nice. Yeah, I've been pulling a lot from Michael Moorcock. I ran an actual play for Demigod a couple months ago, right before I interviewed Neil, and anyone who listened to it probably went, "Is this motherfucker just copying the Neverending Story mixed with Elric?" And the answer was yes.
That's one of the cool things about Scion, though. Like, I really love that game, and I sort of drop the seed of the idea about it every once in a while, and I probably will continue to do so until Rich Thomas either just flat out tells me to shut up or lets me do it. But I think that there would be a cool space to explore where Scion and Scarred Lands overlap. I think if you are a 5e fan and you like Scarred Lands and you've never checked out Story Path System, you should go pick up Scion, because I think you would really dig it. And the opposite is true. I think if you like Scion a lot, check out Scarred Lands, because I think you'll dig it. It's they're definitely cousins, like in terms of like of just theme and feel.
Okay. Oh yeah, I do like Scion. It's my second favorite story path system. My first being They Came From. That one, just the rules I grokked a lot faster than the other two.
Yeah, They Came From is a fun game. I am a dyed in the wool Trinity fan. I've been a Trinity aficionado since I first saw the announcement, like in the back of, I don't know, it was Clan Book Ravnos or something, that said, in 1998, White Wolf takes you beyond the world of darkness to the stars. I was like, fucking sold.
Mine was
Mine's
a tumultuous journey from 3.5 D&D to Chronicles of Darkness to Exalted to Old World of Darkness. Exalted's my game, though. That is, if I had been recording when I did my old second edition games, you would notice a lot of shonen tropes when I ran that.
That's fair. It's a good place for it.
Yeah. Well, because the sky's a physical object in creation. At least it was in second edition. So someone got knocked in the air, and so he did a stunt where he's like, I flip, I let the hit carry me to the sky, I launch off the sky, and I punch him in his fucking face.
Yeah, I love the sheer level of that, of, like, I guess for lack of a better term, absurdity that one can bring to a Exalted game.
It is a great thing. My next question for you actually is, because not everything you want in your own games necessarily fits in, let's say, a rule book for everyone else, what kind of house rules do you like to implement in your own Scarred Land games?
That's a good question. It's a little weird for me because I have been running streams so much lately. Like almost all my gaming now is done in front of an audience, right? Mm-hmm. And in that position, specifically when I'm doing Scarred Lands, I am very much brand ambassador guy.
Yeah.
So I have tried to minimize my amount of house ruling, just because I don't want to miscommunicate the rules to somebody who's just running into it for the first time.
No, that makes perfect sense.
But having said that, though, and this annoys, I have one player in particular, Sarah Stewart, who, I love you, Sarah, and I'm sorry, I'm going to call you out on this podcast, but I totally am. she's very much a power gamer. She's very much a rules lawyer, and she's very much a twink. Like I want. If we were playing Rift, she'd be playing a glitter boy. It's true. And so, I know this gets under her skin a lot, but I am a big fan of hand wavium, and of allowing yourself the freedom to do what the story dictates, and who gives a shit what it says in the book, both with rules and with narrative. But I do that a lot less, which I'm sure would also be a surprise to my players to know. I do that a lot less on stream than I do like at a private table. If I'm at a private table, I'm like, if you get a general idea of, because I don't expect you to sit down at my table and be a scholar of the setting we're playing. So if you have a general idea of the feel and flavor of the game we're playing, you'll be fine. If you spend all of your time becoming a lore hound, you will probably be disappointed because, first of all, I'm not. When I write a book for this, I consult other books. I don't memorize the lore. I have other things up there in my head. You know what I mean? Like I memorize the neat lore that I like. But if I'm getting into some corner of the universe that I don't usually interact with, I reference it. And then if it comes up in a game and it's not pertinent to the story I'm telling, or it would be much more narratively convenient to me that it were different, I just change it. Yeah, and I encourage people to do that whenever possible. These books are there to inspire and to provide a framework. It's not some holy canon handed down on 3 tablets until Mel Brooks drops one of them. It's a set of guidelines and a set of ideas. I would say if you're going to make big drastic rule changes or big drastic lore changes, let your players know that, have a conversation about it. But I mean, if you're making detailed choices on the fly, there's nothing to me that will grind the fun out of a game faster than like we have to stop and correct this minutia of the lore so that this whole narrative works.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's
work for writers and developers and people who are getting paid for their time to do.
Yeah. Because I run the Facebook page where I just make a lot of memes. I think you've probably seen a few of them. At one point I made a Werewolf the Apocalypse meme, and I realized I put a house rule in that meme because someone's like, "Is that what the rule says?" And I'm like, "Does it not? I haven't looked at the rules section in 5 years."
Right.
Shit.
Well,
but this is getting enough reacts to where apparently lots of people house ruled it this way.
Right. Well, and the other thing that's funny about that is there are so many things that if I wasn't streaming, I'm sure I would house rule and never know I had house ruled them. You know what I mean? Because I wouldn't be compelled to look them up. I would just go with what sounds right in my head. And I think it's funny because I've had some discussions with the Onyx Path folk who've been doing this since the White Wolf days, and since like the original White Wolf days. And even like in creating like the 20th anniversary editions, a lot of the mission statement was, you don't need to create the books we had. You need to make it feel like the books we had, except with rules that work better under scrutiny.
You mean I can't take a 3-point merit that makes me immune to silver? You're talking madness, Travis.
Right, I know, right? But, because so many people did that. So many people would, who was stopping combat every round to go and look up how a particular role was supposed to go? No one. You would make your call and you would move forward. If there was confusion or dispute, I mean, maybe I'm an anomaly and every gamer I know is an anomaly, but I've never sat at a table unless there was a stream happening where people would stop a combat to look up a rule unless there was a dispute about how that rule went.
Yep.
That to me, that was always the mark of like, oh, that person's a rules lawyer, and that's going to grind all my fun down to nothingness. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But bless the rules lawyers, they're fun. And another thing that is I will say about gaming in the 21st century that I absolutely love in terms of sticking closer to what's in the books for the rules is now that everyone has a reader, in their pocket. everybody can open a PDF on their phone, if nothing else, right? Now the GM has a freedom to offload some of that onto the players, even in real time, that maybe wasn't there in the past. Okay, I'm going to cast Firebolt at this person. Okay, well, why don't you tell me what Firebolt does? Oh, well, yeah, let me just go look it up. Let me click on the Firebolt thing on my D&D Beyond sheet, and it will bring up and tell me what Firebolt does. Or let me search in the PDF, and it will tell me what that spell does. It's a very different environment than, I got to look up my spell. Hold on, let me try to remember which book it's in.
I remember the 20 to 30 pound backpack that got hauled around with the 3.5 books before PDFs were a thing.
Exactly.
I actually relied on my rules lawyers. I'm like, hey, what's this rule again? Thanks.
Yeah, you could tell the person who had the best command of the rules probably because they had a duffel bag that looked like they were, getting ready to invade a foreign country, and they had arms 4 times as big around as their head from carrying around 60 books, everywhere they went.
We created a throne, one of our games, with all the books we had.
Yeah, it was absurd. I ran a Mage of the Ascension game for 3 years in the late 90s. We met at a Denny's every Sunday night, and I would walk into that Denny's, and I kid you not, I was carrying 12, not small mage books, in a duffel bag. And I'd come in and thunk it down, and everyone in the entire restaurant would kind of look over at me because it sounded like I tried to flip the table over.
Yep.
It was not. And now I can have all that in my pocket.
Yep, exactly. It's great. I always GM now with my laptop in front of me, and I have my notes peppered through several documents and things like that, and I can just switch between them real easy. And if I need to look up a gift, I put in my notes the page reference.
Right. This is the page number, and there we go. Well, and it's funny too because I'm at the age where, despite the fact that I'm running on a stream and I have, a camera in my face, the computer in front of me, all my resources at my fingertips. Never mind that I also have a phone and a tablet that can also access these things. I still find myself probably 50% of the time grabbing a hard copy book and flipping through it just because of habit.
Yep. Let me just turn this on because I got.
Yeah, exactly.
Every time, man. Every time.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's something about the feel of a book, and there's something about having that tactile experience. There's a merit to it, but I really have tried to parse down my role-playing game collection to books that I genuinely either genuinely enjoy above and beyond the average supplement, or something that I contributed to, or something that I really want to make sure that I have spent as much money on as possible on.
That makes sense.
To support the creators. I have a hard copy of They Came From Beneath the Sea because I backed that on backer kit after the Kickstarter was over. I have a hard copy of Cavaliers of Mars because it's one of the greatest role-playing games ever made, and because Rose Bailey is an amazing carbon-based life form. I have stuff like that. I have physical Pugmire books. I've worked on them, and because I love Pugmire. I sure do have the special edition foil cover creature collection. But it's not the, oh boy, we need to buy a new bookshelf because there's I've run out of space with all the 3.5 books. That those days are gone.
Okay. They are not gone for me. I am a dice goblin, but also a book goblin. And it's just a habit I have. I have Cavaliers of Mars. I really want to run it at some point. I might reach out in a future episode to pick your brain about what you think about Cavaliers and how you run that game, because that sounds like a fun conversation.
I would love to let you know as soon as I get a chance to run it. I've been wanting, actually, myself to put together a stream for it for the Twitch channel, because I don't know if Matthew mentioned or if I mentioned, but In addition to doing Scarred Lands, I'm the Twitch programming coordinator for Onyx Path. So I do all the scheduling of the programming there, and
Okay.
I've really wanted to get a regular or at least an extended Cavaliers show on the channel, and bought the book partially because I was ready to roll up my sleeves and do it myself if I couldn't get somebody else to put it together. But then obviously, my time is a little bit taken up at the moment.
No, I hear you. Not enough time to run all the games I want to run, man. I'm maxed out at 2.
Yeah. It's hard, and obviously with the Kickstarter going on, trying to do promotions for that, and we just came off the back of releasing Frostlands Ephemerolake as well, which is an expansion for Scarred Lands that opens the northern continent up for community content. And it's the first time that this continent has been introduced for 5th edition. And so we've been doing a lot of streaming to promote that as well. So these are have been back-to-back releases. So my time has just really been very thin. But as soon as I'm clear of these woods, I absolutely intend to dive into some Cavaliers of Mars for the channel. Nice. So everyone who's listening should go make sure that they not only back Dead Man's Rest on Kickstarter, but tell 3 of your friends to do the same, so that I can have a gangbusters, awesomely successful Kickstarter, so that I can take a breather and put together a Cavaliers of Mars game. If for no other reason, if the whole thing hasn't convinced you, everything you've heard hasn't convinced you how awesome Scarred Lands is, just go back it so we can get to a Cavaliers of Mars stream quickly.
You heard it here first. Everyone, this is in fact the Travis Legge Cavaliers of Mars Kickstarter event.
I'm telling you, if Rose threw up a Kickstarter for an expansion tomorrow, I would be all over it.
Absolutely, because I've been a big fan of like the John Carter of Mars stuff growing up. Once you pull some of the 1920isms out of it.
Right. Which Cavaliers does a pretty good job of evoking that feel without evoking all the baggage that comes along with it.
Yeah, and that was kind of my issue with the actual game of John Carter of Mars. It does a very, very good job of making you feel like you're in John Carter of Mars. Unfortunately, it also makes you realize you're playing John Carter of Mars.
Right.
And,
this is a little too accurate.
It's like, we worked with the the Barros estate. Did you have to? Was it necessary?
Exactly.
Because I listen to audiobooks when I lift, and I went back and revisited the John Carter of Mars. I'm like, there's a lot of 20isms here, but it's not the worst of the 1920isms I've ever heard. And then I went and listened to the first Tarzan, which I had never read, and it's, it sucks real bad when you're benching like 185 pounds and you hear just 3 sentences of nothing but racial slurs, and you're just like, Jesus Christ, as the weight's coming down on you.
It's being crushed in 2 ways at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting, not to keep us too far afield, but one of the other things I had the opportunity to work on recently was Adventure, which I would assume will be coming up fairly soon for Kickstarter itself. And Adventure is the Trinity Continuum game that's set in originally set in the 1920s. They have now moved the setting forward to the 30s.
Okay.
For a number of reasons, not the least of which is the ability to punch Nazis in game. Strong motivation. And
I recall hearing that in a stream.
Yeah, I 100% endorse it. But in working with that, trying to thread the needle of we do not want to ignore what was going on in the world at that point, right?
Yeah.
By any stretch of the imagination, but we also want to make very clear that we're not condoning it, and that's not our work. That's not considered a virtue in our world. That the heroes of our world, stand against that, just like the heroes of the real world did at the time. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
Like,
it's one of the reasons I really liked Harlem Unbound is because it did a very good job of presenting that ugly aspect of America and showing how you can implement it in I guess for a lack of a better word, safe way so that everyone has buy-in and things like that.
right, exactly, and that's the and I think that a good, obviously, if you're talking about, planetary romance on fictionalized Mars, you don't have to do that so much. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? But when you're talking about, like, we're going to set a game in the 1930s in the really real world, yeah, you gotta you. I think you have a responsibility um, to address those issues like an adult, and present your audience with the tools to address those issues like an adult. Even in Scarred Lands, which is a straight up made up from whole cloth fantasy ass never existed world, um, because there are elements that are disturbing, upsetting. We spend time speaking to the reader, be they a player or a GM, about, these are some of the ways you might want to address making sure your players are safe. These are, there's a Greek myth, there's a Greek mythology inspiration to Scarred Lands, and in the lore, that means there's some Greek mythology-ish stuff that happened, right?
Yep. Yep.
You know what I mean? And if I don't know if you've, the dear
Yep.
dear listener, if you've ever looked at Greek mythology, terrible things happened in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, talking about, like, how do you represent that? If you represent that at the table, how do you represent it? What do we do in the setting to address how X action leads to Y consequence? And what safety tools should you implement? And what setting elements are not going to matter if you decide to ignore? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
giving people the permission to say, you don't have to delve into this topic to be playing Scarred Lands. You can just say, nah, we're not going to mess with that. We're not going to have that show up on our screen, and that's totally fine. But the certainly, just pretending it's not a problem is a problem, and absolutely just presenting it, something of a 20s-ish feel in the same manner in which it would have been presented in the 20s is absolutely a problem.
Yeah.
You
Yep.
know,
I totally hear what you're saying. So, two last things then, Travis, and then I will
Sure.
let you get on to your evening. Just for anyone who's made it this far, one last elevator pitch for Scarred Lands and Dead Man's Rust, and then I'll have the question we ask all of our illustrious guests.
Beautiful. So yeah, just Scarred Lands. All I can say is, it really is probably my favorite Dungeons and Dragons setting, and was long before I ever got a chance to work on it. It's heavy metal, it's horror, it's post-apocalyptic fantasy. It's as brutal as you want it to be, but it's grim bright. You have things are bad, but you're the heroes, and you get a chance to make them better. And nothing feels better to me at the table than when the heroes, haggard but victorious, view the dawn of a brighter new day because of their actions. And steering right into that, Dead Man's Rust, which will be on Kickstarter now, not only gives you multiple opportunities to do that, but it allows you to be in the driver's seat as players as to how you want to tackle the campaign. And it gives you an opportunity, if you haven't yet even checked out Scarred Lands, we're going to have add-ons and different ways where you can pick up a whole bunch of Scarred Lands product cheaper than you're going to find anywhere else by backing this Kickstarter. So it's really a good opportunity for existing fans to pick up something new and cool, or for people who are new to the setting to really dive in. And in case I didn't mention it, if you do back it on Kickstarter, we're going to be rolling out the manuscript for the adventure as the Kickstarter is going on while it's live. So you can dive right in and start playing a couple of these adventures, picking up some of the one-shots and some of the side quests and running them as one-shots, really getting to know the world before you're fully committed, right? Because you can always, if you back it for $5, you run a couple of the games and you're like, this isn't my cup of tea. You can you can back out of the Kickstarter. It's really like a no risk proposition, and I am firmly confident that if you check this thing out, you will be chomping at the bit to make sure you get a nice hard copy with all the trimmings and all sorts of expansions to it.
Awesome. And so this is the question we always ask our guests, since we are primarily talking about GMs and GM tips. Travis, if money, people, distance, whatever, was not an obstacle, what would your dream game be to run?
Boy, with people who are currently alive or not?
Either or. Dream game. It can go into any realm of fantasy, or as far out in the weeds as you want.
That is really hard to answer. I've had the unique experience of running games that were developed by people who are heroes of mine for the people who developed them. That box has been ticked for me a little bit.
Fair.
Though I would love to probably get like Gary Gygax, Rich Thomas, Deborah Ann Wall, and Matthew Mercer at a table and run riffs for them. Mainly because that's the most ridiculous thing I could imagine to do if I had that group of people.
Fair.
But
good answer.
I just think it would be. First of all, that's always my go-to. If we're going to do something silly, let's play Rifts. But yeah, that would be the group I would want to play with. I think it would be a lot of fun.
Very cool. Yeah. So, Travis, where can people find you if you want to be found?
I am pretty much everywhere on the internet as at Travis Legge, Legge. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, though I never post on there. And when I'm not there, I have a Patreon, also patreon.com/Travis Legge, where I talk a little bit about the things behind the scenes for my own independent work that's not part of Onyx Path. And you can find me on Twitch at the Onyx Path, twitch.tv/the Onyx Path, or at my own channel, which is twitch.tv/Plastic Age Plays, like Silver Age or Golden Age, but plastic.
All right, perfect. And I'm Keegan with A Bunch of Gamers. You can find us on Facebook, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, but you will never find me on Twitter. I find it a cesspool. Thank you.